On the Ethereum blockchain, both contracts and accounts are identified by address. However, in Sway, accounts and contracts are identified differently. Accounts will have an address, and contracts will have a contract ID. Inside the Sway programming language, both of these address and contract ID are put into one in a data structure called identity. So identity will either be an address or a contract ID. Let me show you some examples of an address. In Sway, an address is represented as bits 256 wrapped in a struct called address. So let's say that B is of type B256 is equal to a random B256. And then to create an address, let's say that ADDR of type address is equal to address : from bits 256. This will create an address. To get back the value inside this address struct, the value inside will be this bits 256. You can say that B of type will be again B256 will be equal to ADDR.into. So to create an address from bits 256, you will call the function from, and to get the bits 256 inside the address, you will call the function into. Moving on, let's take a look at an example of contract ID. Similar to an address, contract ID is also a struct that wraps bits 256. For example, let's again start with the same bits 256, and then to create a contract ID, let's say that my contract ID of type contract ID is equal to contract ID : from the bits 256 B. And like we did for the example above, to get the bits 256 wrapped in the contract ID struct, you would say that B of type B256 is equal to my contract ID dot into. Identity is an enum that wraps contract ID and an address. So let's take a look at an example. Again, we'll start with some random bits 256, and then let's first create an address. So say that ADDR of type address is equal to address : from the random bits 256. And then to create an identity, that my ID of type identity is equal to identity, and here we're creating an identity of address. So say : address. And then inside here, we'll put in the address that we created above, ADDR. So this will create an identity of type address. Let's take a look at an example of creating an identity of type contract ID. To create an identity of a contract, you do something similar. So I'll copy this, paste it here. And then instead of saying address, we'll say contract ID. And inside here, we'll need to put in a contract ID. So what we can do is put in this contract ID that we created over here. Inside here, type my contract ID. So this is how you would create an identity in Sway. How about if you wanted to go the other way around? You have some identity and you want to know if it's an address or a contract ID. So let me show you an example. For this example, we'll be using the identity that has an address inside. And to find out what value is inside the identity, whether it's an address or a contract, what you would do is type match my ID. So we're matching an identity. If my identity, let's say, is an address, then you would type identity : address. And then we can also pattern match for the value inside, ADDR. Then let's return the inner address, ADDR. Otherwise, the identity will be a contract ID, identity : contract ID. And inside it will be the contract ID. We'll name this variable ID. And in this case, we'll just revert 0. This pattern matching returns an address. So let's assign this to a variable. Let ID of type address is equal to match my ID. If my ID matches an address, then it returns the inner address, which is of type address. If my ID does not match an address and it is a contract ID, then we revert this pattern matching. So the code execution fails over here. And lastly, we'll put a semicolon here. Okay, lastly, if we wanted to return an identity, here's how you would do it. So instead of Boolean, you'll say identity. And then likewise over here, and over here, instead of returning true, we'll return, let's say, my ID. And that is an example of address, contract ID, and identity. Let's compile the contract and make sure that we don't have any errors. Open my terminal and then type fork build. And the contract compiles successfully.